He signed the divorce papers at 11:43 in the morning. By midnight, 12 black cars were coming to collect what he'd thrown away. Dante Morelli didn't look up when his attorney slid the papers across the desk. He just picked up the pen, uncapped it with his teeth, and signed his name 4 times in the spaces where the little yellow arrows pointed, like he was approving a shipment manifest, like it meant nothing. Elena Vale sat across from him and watched him do it. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Sat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine perfectly straight, and she watched her husband of 3 years reduce their marriage to a transaction. And when it was done, she picked up her own pen and signed her name in the same 4 spaces with the same quiet efficiency. And then she set the pen down and said, "Thank you, Dante." He finally looked at her then. He didn't know what he expected. Tears, maybe. A last attempt at explanation. 3 years of marriage, and she'd never once raised her voice at him, never once fought back. And some cold part of him had expected that pattern to hold even here, even at the end. But her eyes were steady. No red rims. No trembling lip. She stood, buttoned the single button on her jacket, and walked out. Dante watched the door close behind her and felt, for one sharp, irrational second, like he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. Then Silas Creed put a hand on his shoulder and said, "You did the right thing, boss." And Dante packed that feeling, so somewhere, dark, and locked it. If you are watching this story, and you want to know how it ends, how a man who controlled an empire lost everything to the one person he never thought to fear, then stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single episode, and hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened that night when the 12 black cars came through those gates, you need to understand what kind of man Dante Morelli was, and what kind of woman he never knew Elena Vale to be. Dante had built his empire the way most men built things in his world, slowly, violently, and with the consistent willingness to do what softer men refused. He'd taken over his father's organization at 26, after his father had a stroke that left the old man's right side slack and his speech gone. And Dante had stepped into the role without ceremony and without hesitation, which was the only thing that kept the other crews from testing him in those first 6 months. He was good at the work. He had his father's instincts and his mother's patience, which was a dangerous combination in his business. He didn't lose his temper at the wrong times. He didn't posture. He paid what he owed, collected what was his, and built the kind of reputation that made men who'd never met him think twice before they did something stupid in his territory. By the time he was 35, he ran legitimate businesses alongside the criminal ones: 3 restaurants, a construction company, a financial advisory firm that was exactly as above board as it needed to be, and no more. He had 40 men on his direct payroll, and twice that in the extended network, and he had Silas Creed, who had been his father's consigliere before he was Dante's, and who knew where every body was buried. Sometimes literally. Silas was 54, thin. He wore his silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and his suits were always charcoal or navy, and never black, which he considered a vulgarity. He'd been in the organization for 27 years, and he knew Dante's operation better than Dante knew it himself, which Dante had always considered an asset. He'd been wrong about that, too, but that comes later. Elena came into Dante's life at a charity fundraiser for a children's hospital, an event Silas had urged him to attend for appearances, the kind of thing a legitimate businessman showed his face at once a year. She was sitting at a table near the back with 2 older women and a glass of white wine she barely touched. And she had the quality that Dante would later struggle to describe precisely. She made no effort whatsoever to be noticed, and so he noticed her immediately. He sent someone to find out who she was. Elena Vale, 32, daughter of the late Marcus Vale, who had been a finance consultant before his death 7 years earlier, currently working as an analyst for a mid-sized investment firm. No criminal associations, no complications. She was quiet and careful, and she had a way of listening that made you feel she was actually hearing you rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. They were married 11 months later. Silas told Dante it was a good choice. A quiet wife was a safe wife, he said. Someone who asked no questions and kept no secrets of her own. Dante believed him, because in those days, Dante believed almost everything Silas told him. The first 3 years of their marriage were, by Dante's assessment, unremarkable in the way he'd wanted. Elena kept the household running smoothly. She entertained his business associates with competent, unshowy hospitality. She didn't ask what he did in his office at 2 in the morning or why certain men visited the house without ever being introduced to her. She took her space at the edges of his life with a kind of quiet grace that he found. He admitted to himself now and then, faintly insulting, like she didn't want more from him and was politely waiting for him to notice. He never asked what she wanted. He told himself this was a clean arrangement. She had financial security and a protected name. He had a wife who didn't complicate his operations. It worked. What he didn't see, what he was not built to see, because no one had ever made it necessary, was the texture beneath that surface. The way Elena always positioned herself near a door in a crowded room. The way she cataloged names without appearing to. The way her conversations, always brief and pleasant, had a way of ending just before the other person realized they'd said more than they meant to. He didn't see any of it because he wasn't looking. And he wasn't looking because Silas had told him there was nothing there to look for. That was the first manipulation. It would not be the last. The thing that triggered the divorce was a photograph. Silas brought it to Dante 4 months before the signing. In the same quiet way, he brought everything sitting across the desk, fingers laced together, voice low and measured. There was a manila envelope on the discs between them. Silas didn't push it across immediately. He let it sit. "I need to tell you something," Silas said, "and I need you to let me finish before you react." Dante said nothing, which Silas took as permission. There's been a concern raised. About Elena. The photograph showed Elena standing outside a restaurant with a man named Garrett Finch. Finch was 40, well-dressed, known in certain circles as a financial architect, someone who structured things for people who needed their money to be somewhere it couldn't be easily found. In the photograph, Elena's hand was on Finch's forearm. She was leaning toward him. They were close enough that the image, pulled from a certain angle, looked like intimacy. There were 3 more photographs, different dates, different locations, always Finch. "I didn't bring this to you lightly," Silas said. "I had the meetings verified by 2 separate sources. I know what this looks like. I also know what this could mean if Finch is connected to what I think he's connected to." Dante sat with the photographs for a long time. He was not a jealous man by nature, or at least he'd always told himself he wasn't. Something about the images hit a different nerve than jealousy. It was the secrecy. The careful, maintained, professional secrecy, Elena having meetings she'd never mentioned, with a man in an industry that intersected with Dante's in ways that were not comfortable. He didn't confront Elena directly. Later he would recognize this as the moment everything began to break. Instead, he went to Silas and said, "I want to know everything about those meetings." Silas provided what he needed, or what he claimed was what Dante needed. He was thorough about it. Documents, financial records, a timeline of Elena's communications that showed a pattern of contact stretching back 18 months. It all looked damning. It was also almost entirely fabricated. Dante didn't know that yet. He told Elena he wanted a divorce on a Tuesday evening. He came home from the office and found her in the kitchen making coffee, because she often made coffee in the evening, which he'd always found slightly eccentric, and he stood in the doorway and said it straight. "I want a divorce." She turned from the counter and looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes, not surprise. Exactly. Something more like, finally. "All right," she said. He'd prepared arguments, explanations, a version of the truth, the sanitized version. Nothing about Silas or the photographs, and she'd denied him even that. Just, "All right. You're not going to ask why," he said. "Does the reason matter?" "It might." She looked at him for a moment. "Dante, we both know this marriage was never about love. If you've decided it no longer serves its purpose, I'm not going to fight you on it." He felt the words like something cold, not because she was wrong, because she was so precisely right, and she said it with such tired clarity that it made him wonder what she'd been living inside for 3 years while he built his careful, convenient arrangement around her. He said, "The attorneys will handle the rest." She nodded and turned back to her coffee. He stood in the doorway another moment. He wanted her to turn around again. Couldn't have said why. She didn't. Papers were signed at 11:43. By 2 in the afternoon, Dante was back in his office reviewing logistics for a shipment coming in from the coast. Silas was there. Everything was as it always was. Except Dante couldn't concentrate. Kept replaying the moment in the attorney's office. Steadiness of her face. Thank you, Dante. Not sarcastic. Not wounded. Just complete. Like she'd done everything she came to do and was done now. It bothered him more than it should have. More than the photographs had. More than 3 years of nothing remarkable in their marriage. He pushed it down and went back to the shipment. By 7 that evening, he was at the restaurant, one of the legitimate ones, called a place on the north side called Bernavio's that had real food and a wine list his father would have approved of. He ate alone because he often ate alone, and he drank 1 glass of Barolo, and he sat with the feeling he couldn't name, and eventually he decided it was simply the strangeness of a changed situation. He was single again. That was a change. Changes felt strange. This was temporary. He went home at 9. At 1:47 in the morning, he woke. He didn't know what woke him. There was no sound from inside the house. He lay in the dark for a moment, and then the feeling pressed in a prickling wrongness that he'd learned to trust over years of operating in a business where the men who ignored that feeling didn't last long. He got up, moved to the window. The grounds were dark and quiet beneath him, and then they weren't, because headlights appeared at the gate. 1 pair, and then another, and then more, until there were 12 sets of headlights moving in a controlled procession up the main drive. And even in the dark, Dante could see the vehicles were black and identical and well-maintained, and that they weren't moving like men who were lost or uncertain. They knew exactly where they were going. He was reaching for his phone when the cars stopped and the doors opened and the men who got out moved with the particular efficiency of people who'd been trained to secure a location. And Dante watched them form a perimeter around the house, not aggressive, not sloppy precise. And he stood at the window in his sleep, clothes, with his phone in his hand, and thought, who in God's name did I marry? And then the front door opened. Elena walked out. She was dressed, not formally, but deliberately dark coat, dark shoes, her hair pulled back. She had a single bag over one shoulder, which meant she'd packed before she went to sleep, which meant she'd known they were coming, which meant one of the men stepped forward and opened the rear door of the lead car and bowed his head. Mrs. Vale, your family has come to take you home. Dante heard it through the glass. The window was thick and the distance was real, but the night was still and his hearing was good. Mrs. Vale, not Mrs. Morelli. She'd never changed her name. He'd thought nothing of it at the time. She'd kept it for professional reasons. She'd said, and he'd thought nothing of it. Your family has come to take you home. Elena paused before she got into the car, turned, and looked up at the window where Dante was standing. 3 years of marriage, and he'd never once seen her look at him the way she looked at him in that moment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't satisfaction. It was, he turned the word over for days afterward, trying to find something better for it, and he couldn't. Pity. She looked at him with something clean and quiet and final, and then she said, and again the night carried it perfectly, you should have asked who I was before you let them convince you to destroy me. She got into the car. The door closed. The 12 black cars turned and moved it back down the drive in the same unhurried, organized way they'd come, and within 2 minutes the grounds were empty again. And Dante was standing at the window in the dark, with his phone in his hand, and every piece of certainty he'd built his life on, beginning to crack at the foundation. Before you let them convince you. Not before you decided. Not before you chose. Before you let them convince you. He called Silas at 2:24 a.m. Silas picked up on the second ring, which was notable in itself. Silas slept like a man with a clear conscience, which now struck Dante as a detail worth examining. The Vale family has a security operation, Dante said. Silence. Then I'm not sure I follow. 12 cars just left my property with my ex-wife in them. Professional security. Organized, coordinated, expensive. The man who spoke to her addressed her as Mrs. Vale and told her her family had come for her. So I want to know, Silas, everything you know about the Vale family. Another silence. Shorter. We should talk about this in person. I'm not interested in person. I want to know right now what you know about Marcus Vale. Dante right now. Silas cleared his throat. Marcus Vale died 7 years ago. Legitimate finance consultant, as far as my records show. Elena's his only daughter. Beyond that, I don't have anything that would explain what you're describing. Dante stood with the phone against his ear and looked out at the empty drive and said nothing for a long moment. Are you certain? He said. I'll have my team look into it first thing. Tonight. It's 2 a.m. tonight, Silas. He hung up. He stood at the window for another 10 minutes. Then he went downstairs and poured 2 fingers of bourbon and sat at the kitchen table. Her kitchen table, where she'd been standing when he told her he wanted out, where she'd been making her evening coffee, and he thought about 3 years of a woman who never raised her voice and never asked questions and knew exactly where the window was from every room in the house. He thought about your family has come to take you home. He thought about before you let them convince you. He drank the bourbon, and he turned the phrase over and over, and he understood, sitting alone in the kitchen at 2:30 in the morning, that the phrase had a specific weight. It wasn't a general accusation. It was a pointed one. Them. He put the glass down. He picked up his phone and pulled up every financial record he had access to from the last 3 months. He didn't know what he was looking for. He knew he'd recognize it when he found it. At 4:15 in the morning, he found the first one. A shipment that had been scheduled for destruction flagged by federal authorities as a liability. A thing that needed to disappear quietly had been redirected. Not destroyed. Redirected. The paperwork showed the destruction. The actual movement of the product showed something else. And the discrepancy was buried in a layer of logistic routing that was thorough and careful and had been constructed by someone who understood exactly how Dante's operation filed things. He didn't catch it until he was looking for it. He went back further. He found 3 more. He found at the margins of financial records he'd reviewed and signed off on small alterations. Not theft, nothing crude. Shifts, reallocations. Money moved from one account structure to another, in amounts small enough to miss if you weren't counting every line. And over 18 months, those amounts accumulated into a number that was not small at all. He sat with the number on the screen. Then he found the warnings. In the 2 months before the divorce was finalized, there had been 3 attempts on his life. He'd known about them. His security team had caught wind each time. Just barely, just early enough. Dante had written it off as an unsettled period, a tension in his territory that would sort itself out. He'd been grateful for the early warnings and hadn't asked hard enough where those warnings originated. He traced them back now, not to his security team's intelligence, not to any of his known contacts. The warnings had come through an intermediary who passed them to his head of security as tips from a clean source. Dante dug into the intermediary. The intermediary connected, through 2 careful removes, to a communications channel that he didn't recognize and couldn't immediately decode. He sat with that for a long time. Then he typed Marcus Vale into his private database. Not the public records. The other one. The one that held the things his organization had collected over 2 decades of operating in proximity to every kind of power and crime and crossover between them. Marcus Vale, 51 at death, financial consultant. And beneath that, a single flagged entry that someone had buried under 3 levels of access restriction, so that you'd only find it if you already suspected it was there. Subject had known contact with the Adriano network. Status: informant. Reason for termination: unclear. Case closed. The Adriano network. Dante knew the name. Everybody in his business knew the name. The Adriano network was, or had been, one of the most quietly powerful criminal intelligence operations in the country. Run not through violence and territory, but through information. They collected it. They structured it. They sold it selectively. And they held the rest as leverage. They'd been dismantled, or so everyone believed, roughly 8 years ago. A federal operation that pulled out key figures and left the remainder to scatter. Marcus Vale had been connected to them. Marcus Vale had died 1 year before that dismantling. And Elena Vale had married Dante Morelli 2 years after her father's death. Dante closed his laptop and sat in the kitchen and felt the shape of the thing begin to emerge from the dark, the way a coastline emerged from fog. First the outline, rough and uncertain, and then the details, and then the understanding that you were much closer to shore than you'd thought. She hadn't married him for money. She hadn't married him for protection. She'd married him because she suspected his organization had been compromised from within, and a seat inside his household was the only vantage point from which she could safely watch and confirm it. Her silence had not been obedience. It had been surveillance. Every late-night conversation he'd had in what he thought was the privacy of his own home, every name he'd dropped, every logistical detail he'd discussed on the phone in the kitchen while she made coffee in the next room. Every time Silas came to the house and sat with him in the study, and Elena had quietly refilled the coffee tray and left without a word. She hadn't been avoiding those conversations. She'd been listening to every single one. Dante put his hand flat on the table. He needed to think. He needed to be careful and deliberate and not react the way he'd reacted to the photographs, with his gut and his pride and without enough questions. Photographs. He pulled up his private messages and found the contact he needed, a man named Brewer who did technical verification work and owed Dante a clean favor. He sent a message with 3 of the images Silas had given him attached. Verify these: origin, chain of custody, date authentication. Tonight he waited. At 6:08 in the morning, Brewer messaged back. 2 of the 3 are composites. Good work, better than average. The 3rd is real, but the metadata's been stripped and restamped. Someone built these with access to quality source material and time. Not a rush job. Dante read the message 3 times. He set his phone down on the table. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten that specific gray that came just before the actual dawn, the color that looked like the world holding its breath. Dante Morelli, who had built an empire on the principle that the only person you could trust completely was yourself, sat in the kitchen of the house he'd lived in for 11 years and understood that he had been maneuvered, not by his enemies, by the man who'd spent 27 years standing at his right hand telling him who his enemies were. He thought about Elena's face at the window. Before you let them convince you to destroy me, she had known. Maybe not everything, not all of it, but she had known the shape of it, that the pressure on Dante to end the marriage hadn't originated with Dante himself, that something had been engineered, and that she was the target of it, and that if Dante moved without asking the right questions, the engineering would succeed. She had tried to tell him, not with words. He wouldn't have believed words. She'd tried to tell him with the things she'd moved, and the warnings she'd passed, and the evidence she'd quietly arranged. And he hadn't seen it because he'd been looking at photographs that told him what he'd already, on some level, been afraid of. He was afraid of her, not of what she could do to him physically. He was afraid of the specific vulnerability she represented, a person inside his life who understood it completely, a person who had access to him in ways no enemy ever could, because no enemy had ever been trusted enough to eat at his table and sleep in his house and watch him think. Silas had understood that fear, and Silas had used it. Dante's phone rang. The number was one he didn't recognize. He answered it. Elena's voice came through calm, unhurried, as though she were calling from an office on an ordinary Tuesday. "You've been up all night," she said. "You found something. Several things. The photographs are fabricated. Financial redirections are real, but they're not what they look like. And Marcus Vale's connection to the Adriano network is something we need to discuss in person." Dante was quiet for a moment. "You've been watching my records. Only the ones I helped build." He absorbed that. "Where are you?" "Somewhere safe. It won't stay that way for long, so I need you to listen to me carefully. You're going to tell me about Silas." The pause on the line was the first real surprise he'd heard from her in 3 years. "How much do you already know?" she said. "Enough to know the photographs came from him. Enough to know the warnings about the assassination attempts came through you. Enough to know you've been inside this operation longer and deeper than I gave you credit for, and that you're connected to a network I thought was gone." Another pause. Shorter. "The Adriano network isn't entirely gone," she said. "What the federal operation dismantled was the public structure. The intelligence repository survived. My father built part of it. When he was killed, Dante, it was not an accident I became the custodian of what he'd collected." Dante was very still. "Your father was killed by the network inside my organization. By one person in your organization. One person who's been running his own operation parallel to yours for a long time, using your infrastructure as cover. He didn't want my father's intelligence collection to surface. He didn't want me near you, and when I got near you anyway, he spent 3 years trying to find a way to separate us that you wouldn't question. Dante's jaw tightened. He found one. He found what he knew would work on you. A suggestion of betrayal from someone you'd never learned to trust completely. The silence between them was different now. Not empty. Dense. Those 12 cars, Dante said. They're not protection. No, she said. And something shifted in her voice, the first crack in that steadiness. Just slight, just a splinter. They're not. Someone gave the order last night. Someone who knew about the divorce, knew I'd be isolated, knew the timing was right. Dante was already standing. Where are you, Elena? I told you. Where specifically are you? She told him. He was out of the house in 4 minutes. Dante drove, like the city, wasn't real, running, lights, cutting through intersections, one hand on the wheel and the other wrapped around his phone until his knuckles were white. He wasn't thinking about the traffic. He wasn't thinking about anything except the address Elena had given him and the specific quality of her voice in those last seconds before she hung up, not afraid. Exactly, but compressed, like a person holding very still because movement would give them away. She'd told him an abandoned private club on the south end of the warehouse district, a place called Bella Corte that had shut down 3 years ago after a liquor license dispute, that everyone in the city understood had nothing to do with liquor. He knew the building. He'd never had business there directly, but he knew it the way. He knew most things in his territory, the way a man learns the geography of the water he swims in, not by studying maps, but by moving through it long enough that the shape becomes instinct. He parked 2 blocks north and went the rest of the way on foot, which cost him 4 minutes he didn't have, and probably saved his life, because when he came around the east corner of the building, he saw the car, black, parked tight against the alley wall, with its lights off, and its engine running. He could see the exhaust rising in the cold morning air. Someone sitting in the driver's seat, someone else outside. Outside the vehicle, standing near the building's side entrance with his shoulders angled the specific way men angled their shoulders when they were wearing something heavy beneath their jacket. Not Elena's people. Wrong posture. Wrong positioning. Dante pulled back around the corner and thought for exactly 12 seconds. Then he called Renzo, not his head of security, not anyone in the upper structure. Renzo was a driver, technically. In practice, he was the man Dante called when he needed something done by someone who hadn't been briefed by Silas Creed. I need 2 men at Bella Corte. South Alley now. Don't tell anyone. Renzo didn't ask questions. That was why Dante used him. He went around to the north entrance, which took an additional 3 minutes, and required him to climb through a loading bay that smelled like mildew and old wood. And then he was inside the building and moving through the dark, with his hand along the wall and the layout assembling itself in his head from what he knew of buildings like this main floor, service corridor, private rooms at the back where the serious business always happened. He found Elena in the 3rd room. She was sitting at a round table with a single overhead light on, and she wasn't alone. There was a man seated across from her mid-40s, compact, with the specific alertness of someone who'd been in security work long enough that it had become physiological. He had both hands visible on the table, which Dante recognized as a deliberate choice. He was trying not to get shot. Smart. Elena looked up when Dante came through the door. Her eyes went to his hands, first checking for a weapon, and then to his face, and something in her expression shifted, though not by much. Not relief exactly. More like, okay then, this is what we have to work with. Dante, she said. This is Harlan. He's been coordinating my security for the last 18 months. Harlan nodded once, didn't offer a hand. Dante pulled out a chair and sat down and looked at Elena directly. The men outside are not yours. No. How long have they been there? Harlan made them about 40 minutes ago. They were already positioned when we arrived. Dante looked at Harlan. How many? 2 we can confirm. Possibly a 3rd on the roof. We caught movement up there 20 minutes ago, but nothing since. Who sent them? Harlan looked at Elena. Elena said, we think Silas found out where I was going last night before I left. Not after, before. Dante went very still. He knew about the cars. He knew I had a contingency. He may not have known the full scope of it, how many men, the network involved, but he knew I had somewhere to go if the divorce went through, and he knew I'd move fast. She paused. He also knows that if I get somewhere safe and I have time, I'll start talking. So his window is small. The men outside aren't here to capture you. No, she said, they're not. The word settled in the room, like something dropped from a height. Dante's jaw tightened. He looked at the table, then back at her. How long have you known about Silas? With certainty, 8 months. Suspicion going back further, close to 2 years. 2 years. Yes. And you said nothing. She looked at him steadily. I said things, Dante. You weren't in a position to hear them. He wanted to push back on that. He wanted to say he'd always been a fair man, an observant man, a man who heard what people told him. But he sat in that cold room at 6 in the morning with the echo of before you let them convince you still moving through him. And he didn't say it because the honest part of him, the part he usually kept very quiet, knew she was right. He hadn't been listening to her. He'd been managing her. 2 very different things. Tell me about your father, he said. Something moved across her face. Not grief, or not only that something older and more settled, the way grief looked on a person after it had been living with them for years, and they'd learned to work around its furniture. My father was a financial architect, she said, not in the euphemistic sense. In the actual sense, he built information structures, systems for organizing and cross-referencing financial intelligence that, at the time he built them, were genuinely ahead of what most federal agencies had access to. He did it for the Adriano network because they paid well, and because he believed, at least initially, that their intelligence work was a counterbalance to certain organizations that were operating without any check whatsoever. He believed he was doing something useful. He believed that for about 3 years. Then he started to understand the full picture of what the Adriano network did, what the Adriano network did with, and he helped to elect, and he tried to pull back. He tried to create a separate repository, a private archive, outside their control that could be used as leverage, insurance, and someone found out. Someone in the network that the Adriano people were monitoring. Someone who had more to lose from my father's archive becoming public than anyone else. She held his gaze. That someone reached into the Adriano network through a contact they'd cultivated for years and had my father removed. The word removed was the coldest word Dante had ever heard a person use for their parents' death. Silas, he said. Silas had a relationship with 2 senior Adriano figures going back further than anyone knew. He wasn't working for them. It was more mutual than that. They shared information. They each protected the other's vulnerabilities. When my father became a problem, Silas had the access and the motive, and the Adriano people had the mechanism. She paused. My father's death was logged as a cardiac event. He was 51 and healthy. I knew the moment I saw the death certificate that something was wrong, and it took me 2 years of careful, quiet work to understand what. Dante said, and then you married me. I married you because your organization was the only one in proximity to Silas that I could get inside without triggering his surveillance. You weren't the target, Dante. You were the door. He absorbed that. It landed differently than he expected, not as an insult, exactly. More like a mirror held up at an angle he hadn't anticipated. You used me. I used the marriage. There's a difference. A beat. You used it too. You wanted a quiet woman who didn't ask questions. We both got what we came for, until Silas decided we'd become more dangerous together than apart. Harlan shifted in his seat. We should move. They're going to make a decision about those men outside soon, and I'd rather we're not here when they do. Dante didn't look away from Elena. What's in the archive? Everything. Payments, communications, financial, routing, the full documentation of Silas's parallel operation going back 14 years. 3 murders he ordered or facilitated, including my father's, including 2 of your men who died in what were logged as operational accidents. Dante's hands were flat on the table. He was pressing them down hard, not because he was angry, or not only that, but because the specific physical pressure helped him stay in his head instead of going somewhere else. Which 2, she told him. He closed his eyes, opened them. I attended both of their funerals. I know. I told their families it was occupational risk. I know, she said again, and her voice had something in it, not quite softness, but the closest thing to it she'd allowed in the last several hours. Stood up abruptly, walked to the wall, put one hand against the brick, and stood there with his back to both of them. For a moment, and it was the most human thing Elena had ever seen him, do the deliberate physical act of a man who needed 30 seconds to get his internal architecture back in order before he could function. Then he turned around. Where's the archive? Secured. Not on me before you ask. It's in a location that only becomes accessible once certain conditions are met. What conditions? My continued well-being, she said. And the matter-of-fact flatness of it was somehow worse than if she'd said it with bitterness. Dead man's switch. Something like that. If I miss a check-in, the archive goes to 3 separate destinations simultaneously. 2 federal, 1 journalistic. A pause. I built it after my father died. I was 29, and I'd just understood that the people who killed him could reach anyone who got too close. So I needed a structure that protected itself independent of my ability to protect it. Dante looked at her for a long moment. You were 29. Yes. And you built a 3-way dead man's switch on an intelligence archive while you were grieving your father. I built it because I was grieving my father. Something shifted in the room. Not warmth, nothing that simple. But a kind of recognition, the way 2 people who've been operating in the dark, sometimes suddenly, briefly, see each other clearly. Harlan stood. We need to go. Right now. And then the lights went out. Not a power failure. Dante knew the difference. The specific abruptness of a circuit being cut versus a grid failure. And this was a circuit. Deliberate and immediate. And in the half-second before the darkness was complete, he saw Elena's hand move to her jacket, and he was already moving toward her position because his instincts were faster than his reasoning, and his reasoning was catching up quickly. He reached the table. His hand found her arm. Door, she said, which told him she already knew which way they were going, and he let her lead because she'd been in this building, and he hadn't, and they moved. Harlan was ahead of them. He'd had a flashlight. Low beam, angled at the floor, the side corridor, moving fast without running, the specific controlled speed of people who knew that running meant noise and noise meant position. Behind them, the sound of the back entrance being breached. They made it to the loading bay. Renzo's 2 men were there. Dante heard one of them before he saw him, a low boss from the shadows near the north wall. He pushed Elena toward them and turned back. Harlan was right behind him. And then a figure appeared at the far end of the corridor, a silhouette, backlit by a phone screen someone was using for light. And Dante got one good look at the face before the man raised his arm. He recognized him. Not a stranger, not some outside hitter brought in from another organization. A man named Covey, who had been on Dante's own payroll for 6 years, who had been at the funeral of one of the men Elena had just named. Dante felt something cold move through him. Not fear, yes, but beneath it, something colder, the understanding that the rot went deep, that Silas hadn't just built a parallel operation. He'd seeded it through Dante's own people, the way rot moved through the inside of wood, invisible until the structure started to fail. Renzo's man fired first. Covey went down. In the noise and the movement and the hard, specific chaos of those next 90 seconds, Dante, Elena, and Harlan made it out through the loading bay and into the alley. And Renzo had a car running, and they were in it and moving before anyone was in a position to follow. Elena sat in the back between Dante and Harlan, and her breathing was controlled, not calm, but controlled. The difference between someone who was frightened and someone who was managing fright, the way a person managed a heavy piece of equipment, both hands in her lap, jaw set. Dante was watching her profile. You knew Covey, she said. Not a question. 6 years. She nodded, just barely. How many of my people does Silas have? I don't have an exact number. I know he has, at minimum, 8 direct loyalists embedded in your crew structure, possibly more at the logistics level. 8. He said the number quietly, the way you said a number when the number was a wound. Out of 40. 8 that I can confirm. The others I don't know. Silas is careful. He doesn't over-recruit because over-recruitment leaves traces. Dante looked out the window. The city moving past in the early morning light. People starting to appear on the sidewalks, ordinary people with ordinary destinations. And he was in a car with his ex-wife who had been running intelligence operations inside his household for 3 years. And 8 of his men were reporting to a man who had ordered 2 of his people killed. Why didn't you run? he said. When you had the archive, when you had the network, why didn't you take the evidence and hand it over and disappear? She was quiet for a moment, because handing over the archive without Silas, being operationally neutralized, first would have given him time to destroy what he couldn't afford to have documented, and to disappear. I've watched him work for 3 years. He's faster than federal process. He needed to be contained before the exposure, not after. And you needed to be inside the operation to make that happen. I needed someone with the standing to contain him from within. She looked at him. That was always going to be you, Dante. The moment I understood what Silas had built inside your organization, you were always the instrument. I just needed you to be the right kind of instrument at the right moment. And instead, I divorced you. Instead, she said, you divorced me. Because Silas understood that if you ever fully trusted me, I became a problem he couldn't manage. So he made sure you never did. Renzo's phone buzzed. He looked at it and passed it back over his shoulder without a word. Dante took it. A text from a number he didn't recognize. 6 words. Silas knows you have her. Move, he looked at the number. No ID. No contact name. Who is this? He said, more to himself than to her. Elena took the phone and looked at the number. Something changed in her expression, quick and quickly controlled. That's a number from inside Silas's own communication structure, she said. Dante looked at her. Someone inside Silas's network is warning us. Yes. Who? She handed the phone back. Someone who's been feeding me information for the last 4 months. Someone Silas trusted and who decided, at some point, that the trust was misplaced. She paused. I don't know their name. I don't know their position. I only know their pattern, and their pattern has been reliable. You're telling me you have a source inside Silas's operation, and you don't know who they are. I'm telling you the information they've provided has been accurate every time, including tonight. She held his gaze. That's more than I knew about some of the people I've worked alongside for years. Renzo said. From the front, where are we going, boss? Dante looked at Elena. Elena said quietly and precisely, I have a location. Cure, off any record Silas has access to. But if we go there, we commit to finishing this. No partial plays. No more divorces, Dante said flatly. She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to humor he'd seen from her in 3 years, and it landed somewhere unexpected in his chest. No more divorces, she agreed. If we go to this location, and we start building what I think we need to build, Silas will know within 12 hours that we're working together. He won't wait after that. And if we don't go, he'll move anyway. The difference is whether we're positioned to respond or not. Dante was quiet for 3 seconds. Renzo, he said, going to give you an address. Renzo nodded. Elena gave the address. They drove. In the back seat, neither of them spoke for a while. The city peeled away behind them, the warehouse district giving way to older residential blocks, and then to the kind of in-between geography that cities kept at their edges, not quite industrial, not quite neighborhood. The forgotten corridors where things could be stored and meetings could be held, and nobody asked careful questions. Dante was running calculations. 40 men on his direct payroll. 8 confirmed Silas loyalists. Unknown number at logistics. If he moved openly, Silas would know before the move was completed. If he moved quietly, he had a window small specific. The ledger, he said. The archive. You said it's in a location that only unlocks if certain conditions are met. Yes. What conditions exactly? A 12-digit code entered at a specific interval, and a biometric confirmation. Biometric. Fingerprint. Mine. A pause. I could have made it more complex. I chose something that was completely unduplicable and completely non-transferable. So as long as you're alive and free, the archive stays controlled. And the moment someone's on its side, I'm a loose end, the archive becomes a wildfire. She looked at him. Silas is smart enough to know that. He's known it for months. That's why the cars last night weren't there to kill me. At least not immediately. He needs to know the archive's status before he can afford to remove you cleanly. Yes. So he's trying to find the location. He's been trying for 4 months. That's why the text tonight. He's escalating because he's out of time and he knows it. Dante looked out the window. There's something you haven't told me, he said. She was quiet, the anonymous source. The one inside Silas's network. You said you've been receiving information from them for 4 months. He turned to look at her. But the photograph Silas brought me the fabricated photographs 5 months ago, which means the source made contact after Silas already moved against you. She didn't answer immediately. Elena, yes. You're thinking the source is connected to the photographs, to the manufacturing of the evidence Silas used against you. Think, she said carefully, that the source may be someone who helped build the operation against me and has since developed regrets, or strategic concerns, or both. A pause. I also think there is a version of this, a version I have not yet ruled out, in which the source is not motivated by regret at all, in which the information they're feeding me is designed to move us in a specific direction, for a specific reason that we don't fully understand yet. Dante looked at her. You think you might have a second manipulator? I think, she said, that I have been careful not to assume I don't. Car turned off the main road. Gravel now crunching under the tires. Dante looked at his hands, at the city disappearing behind them, at the woman sitting beside him who had been inside his home and his life for 3 years while he looked directly at her and saw nothing, and who was now telling him that the trap they were walking into might be bigger and deeper than either of them could see from where they were standing. He thought about Silas sitting across from him in the study. You did the right thing, boss. The hand on his shoulder, the weight of 27 years of apparent loyalty, pressing down on every judgment Dante had made about the man, so that it never occurred to him not once to look at the loyalty itself and ask what was holding it up. He had made Silas indispensable, and Silas had spent 27 years collecting the debt. Renzo stopped the car. The location was a low building, set back from the gravel track, with 2 vehicles parked outside that Dante didn't recognize. Harlan was out of the car first, and a man came out of the building's side entrance and exchanged something with him, a code, a gesture, something wordless and efficient. Elena got out. She looked at Dante over the roof of the car. When we go inside, she said, I'm going to show you the ledger. The full archive? A physical portion of it. Enough to see what we're dealing with. She paused. What you see is going to change how you understand the last 7 years of your organization. Possibly more than 7 years. And I need you to understand something before you look at it. Dante waited. Silas has been positioning for a transfer of control for a long time. He hasn't been building a parallel operation to rival yours, Dante. He's been building one to replace yours. The goal was never to steal from you or undermine you. The goal was to run the same operation under the same name, with himself at the center and your name on the door. Dante was very still. He was going to use you as a figurehead. He was going to remove you eventually. She said, divorce was the first step. Isolation. Then discrediting. Then, when the timing was right and his men were fully positioned, removal. She held his gaze. You have maybe 72 hours before his timeline forces him to accelerate. The morning light was coming up hard now, pale and cold and unsparing. Dante looked at her, this woman he had managed and minimized, and failed to see for 3 years, who had been carrying the full weight of this alone and in silence because he hadn't been the right instrument at the right moment, and who was still here, still standing, still willing to work with the man who had handed her to her enemies, without a second question. Show me the ledger, he said. She held the door. He walked through it. And behind them, on a rooftop, 6 blocks away, a man with a phone to his ear said quietly into the receiver, they're together. Both of them. Yes, exactly where you said they'd be. The ledger was smaller than Dante expected. He'd been imagining something substantial, a thick binder, a hard drive, something with a physical weight proportionate to what Elena had described. What she placed on the table was a black notebook, standard size, the kind you bought at any office supply store. And it looked so setting under the single overhead bulb that Dante almost said something about it. Before he opened it and understood that the ordinariness was deliberate. He turned the first page. The handwriting was small and precise, not Elena's. He realized immediately. Her father's. Marcus Vale had written in a compressed architectural script that packed maximum information into minimum space. And what the first page contained was a timeline. Dates going back 14 years. Names in the left margin. Amounts in the right, and in the center column. Brief descriptions that were coded, but not heavily coded. The way a careful man coded things when he wanted to be able to read them himself under pressure, not so obscure that recovery required a key. Dante read the first 3 entries. Then he turned to Silas's section. It began at Hajj 11. Dante knew because Elena reached across, without speaking, and opened the notebook to the right page, and he understood from the way she did it practiced. Immediate that she'd read this so many times the pages had memory. Silas Creed's section was 8 pages long. Dante read all 8 pages without stopping. When he finished, he closed the notebook and set it flat on the table and put both hands on top of it and sat there for a moment, looking at the wall. His breathing was even. His face was, to a casual observer, completely controlled. Elena was not a casual observer, and she watched the thing happening behind his eyes with the careful attention of someone who understood that the next 60 seconds mattered. 2 men, he said, Carver and Del Rio. Yes. Carver supposedly died in a loading accident in the Garfield warehouse. Del Rio had a car accident on the 94 overpass. He paused. I have the incident reports. Silas wrote the incident reports. I know that. I always knew that. It was standard after an operational loss. Silas drafted the internal documentation. He looked at her. I never questioned it, because it never occurred to me that there was anything to question. I know. He killed them because they found something. Carver found a discrepancy in the logistics routing, approximately 2 years before I arrived. He brought it to Silas directly because Silas was the person you brought things to. That was the structure you'd built, and Silas told him he'd look into it, and 3 days later Carver was dead. She paused. Del Rio came to a similar conclusion through a different route 6 months later. Same result. Dante was very still. He used my own structure against them. He used the fact that your organization's reporting chain ran through him. Every concern, every discovery, every piece of internal intelligence, it all passed through Silas. It had to. You built it that way because you trusted him, and because it was efficient. A pause. It was also a perfect kill system. Anything that threatened him simply never reached you. Dante stood up. He moved to the far wall and stood with his back to her, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the low murmur of Harlan's voice in the next space over, running through something on a phone. When Dante turned around, his face had changed. Not dramatically. He wasn't a man who did things dramatically. Careful organizational neutrality was gone, and what was underneath it was older and harder and entirely different. Tell me about the anonymous source, he said. Everything. First contact was 4 months ago. A text to a number I'd used for one specific communication 6 months prior, a number I'd used exactly once and then retired. Whoever sent the text knew that number had been mine, which means they had access to communication records from inside Silas's surveillance operation, which means it's someone Silas trusted with access to his monitoring. Yes. The text contained one piece of information, a date, and a location where I could find documentation of Silas's financial routing from the previous quarter. I went. The documentation was there. It was genuine. I verified it against 3 independent sources. And after that, periodic contact. Always text. Always a burner that went dark immediately after. The information has been accurate every time, including the warning tonight. She sat down for cross from where Dante was now standing. What I told you in the car is true. I haven't ruled out the possibility that the source has their own agenda, but I also haven't been able to identify a pattern in what they've provided. That suggests deliberate misdirection. Dante was quiet for a moment. What if the source is the person on the roof? Elena looked at him sharply. The rooftop surveillance when we were at Bellacorte, he said. Your man Harlan thought it might be a third shooter, but we never confirmed that. What if it was observation, not threat? What if the source was watching to confirm we got out? Elena sat with that. That would mean they were physically present at Bellacorte, she said slowly, which would mean they knew where you were before we got there, which would mean... She stopped, which would mean they either have access to your location communications or they have access to Silas's real-time intelligence on your position. The silence in the room became a different kind of silence. Harlan appeared in the doorway. He looked between the two of them and read the room accurately. Problem? Possibly, Elena said. She looked at Dante. If the source has access to Silas's real-time intelligence, if they're that embedded then, the warning tonight, Silas knows you have her. Move. was sent while Silas already knew where we were going, which would mean, Dante said, that the warning didn't come from someone trying to help us escape. It came from someone trying to ensure we moved to a specific location. The three of them looked at each other. Harlan moved first. He crossed to the window, small high on the wall, and looked out. Then he moved to the second room, and they heard him checking the rear entrance. And he came back and said, "We're clear right now." But if someone routed us here deliberately, clear right now doesn't mean much. We need to move again, Dante said. If we move, we lose the secure communications setup. Harlan started. We stay in a location someone chose for us. We lose more than that. Harlan looked at Elena. She said, "He's right. We move." Then to Dante, where? My building on Carver Street. Top floor, private access, not on any record that passed through Silas's office. I purchased it through a separate structure 18 months ago. He paused. I didn't tell Silas. First time I ever didn't tell him about a property. Elena looked at him. Why didn't you tell him? She said. Question was specific. She was asking something exact. I don't know, Dante said. At the time I told myself it was a clean investment. Nothing operational, not relevant. But looking back, he stopped. Looking back, I think some part of me had started to feel something couldn't name yet. Some friction. Something that wasn't adding up. He held her gaze. I wasn't ready to examine it, but I apparently wasn't ready to be completely transparent about it either. She nodded slowly, then that's where we go. They were out of the building in 6 minutes. Renzo had repositioned the car, and Harlan had his own vehicle they split between the two. Elena going with Harlan, and Dante in the front with Renzo, and they took different routes to the same stains, to the same destination, and arrived within 4 minutes of each other. The Carver Street building was 7 stories, brick and glass. The lower floors occupied by a property management company that kept consistent office hours and consistent indifference to what happened on the floor above them. Dante had the top floor configured as a working space, secure communications, clean sightlines from every window, kitchen that was stocked because he was the kind of man who thought about logistics, even in places he expected never to need logistics. They were barely through the door when Harlan's phone lit up. He looked at it. His expression shifted in a way that Dante, who'd spent his adult life reading rooms, did not like at all. What? Elena said. Harlan handed her the phone. She read what was on the screen, and something happened to her face that Dante had never seen before. Not fear, not exactly, but a collapse of something. Specific's small internal collapse, like a wall that had been holding for a long time, finally finding the one crack it couldn't patch. She handed the phone to Dante. It was a photograph. High resolution, shot from close range. It showed a man seated at a table in what appeared to be an interrogation room, a small space, bright overhead lighting, nothing on the walls. The man was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with the look of someone who'd been sitting in that chair for a very long time. Dante recognized him. His name was Prescott. He ran the financial infrastructure for the Adriano Network's surviving remnant, the piece Elena had described, the intelligence repository. Elena had mentioned him twice in passing during their conversation at Bellacorte. He was, as far as Dante understood, the person who maintained the technical structure of the archive. Beneath the photograph, 3 words. Since last night, Dante looked up from the phone. Elena was at the window, not looking out, standing with her back to the room, her hand flat against the glass. Her shoulders were set with the particular rigidity of a person choosing not to let their body do what it wanted to do. He has Prescott, she said. Yes, Prescott is the only other person who knows the archive's physical location. Dante went very still. Not the location, Elena said, her voice dropping. Structure. Prescott built the technical redundancies. He knows the architecture of the dead man's switch. He knows which conditions trigger release and which conditions allow suppression. Dante understood it before she finished. If Silas has Prescott long enough, he can learn how to suppress the release without triggering it. She turned from the window. Her eyes were clear, but the skin around them was tight. He wouldn't need to find the archive's physical location. He just needs to understand the mechanism well enough to disable it before he makes his final moves. How long does Prescott last? Harlan said, and the bluntness of it was the bluntness of a professional asking a necessary question. He's not a field operative. He's never been in this kind of situation. She paused. Hours. Maybe a full day if he's determined. But Silas has resources, and she stopped again, her lips together. Silas is persuasive. He's been persuasive for 27 years. The room was quiet. Then Dante said, "There's something else. You went to Bellacorte because someone your network, your contingency plan, had that location set up as a secure point. But Silas's men were already positioned there before we arrived. You said the source warned you that Silas knew about your contingency plan in general terms. But Bellacorte was specific. That's not general knowledge of a contingency. That's specific operational intelligence." Elena looked at him. "Who knew about Bellacorte?" he said. She was quiet for 2 seconds. 3. Prescott, she said. The word landed like something thrown against glass. Prescott knew the Bellacourt location. He helped establish the network's safe points 18 months ago. He would have had the full list. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was a construction now, something being held up manually. If Silas has had him since last night, then Silas knew about Bellacorte before we got there, Dante said, which means the men outside weren't there because of your source's intelligence, or because Silas guessed. They were there because Prescott gave it to him, or was taken specifically for that information, Harlan said. How many safe points are on the list? Dante said. Elena sat down. The sitting was not graceful, it was the movement of someone whose legs made a decision independently. She put both hands on the table. 7, she said. 7 locations Silas now potentially has.
Yes.
Including this one? No. She looked up. Carver Street was never part of the Adriano Network's infrastructure. Prescott doesn't know about it. It's not on the list. Dante allowed himself one breath of something that wasn't quite relief. For now we're safe, he said. For now, the dead man's switch, Harlan said. If Prescott helps Silas understand how to suppress the release, how long do we have before the archive becomes neutralizable? I don't know the exact technical timeline. What I know is that the suppression mechanism requires both Prescott's knowledge and a specific window of access. It's not something Silas can implement from a distance. She paused. He'd need to reach the archive's physical infrastructure directly. Can't do without the location. Which he can't do without the location, she confirmed. But if he suppresses the trigger mechanism, first, the dead man's switch, then the location becomes something he can search for without the clock running. He'd have time. And Silas with time is. She stopped. She didn't need to finish that sentence. They all understood what Silas with time looked like. They were sitting in the consequence of it. Dante pulled a chair out and sat down across from her. Close. Deliberate, Elena, he said. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be exact. She met his eyes, the anonymous source. Every piece of information they've given you, does any of it intersect with Prescott's knowledge specifically? Locations, dates, anything that would have required them to know what Prescott knew? She didn't answer immediately. She was going back through it. He could see it in her face. The careful, precise movement through memory. 1, she said. 3 months ago. The source gave me the date of a meeting between Silas and a federal contact, a meeting held at a location that was on the Adriano safe point list, meaning the source knew the safe point list, or knew about that specific location through another route. But she said it without conviction, and they both heard the lack of it. You've had a source feeding you intelligence for 4 months, Dante said, and that source has access to at least part of the same information Prescott had. What if the source and Prescott aren't separate threads? What if they're the same person? The silence that followed was different from the other silences. It had a texture. Prescott was feeding me intelligence about Silas's operation, Elena said carefully. And Silas captured Prescott last night, and the source sent a warning last night. She was working through it. If Prescott and the source are the same person, then the warning was sent before Silas captured him, as a last action. Or Harlan started. Or Silas let him send it, Dante said. The room went very quiet. Silas let Prescott send the warning, Dante said, because the warning told you to move, and moving you from an unmonitored location to a monitored one. Any of the 7 safe points was more useful to Silas than keeping you stationary. Elena's hands were flat on the table. She was looking at Dante with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between devastation and a cold, precise fury that was turning inward. I built the contingency, she said. I built the safe point. I trusted Prescott to maintain the architecture, and Silas has been watching Prescott for at least as long as he's been watching you, Dante said. Maybe longer. Because Prescott is the load-bearing wall. Take Prescott, and the whole structure becomes accessible. Her jaw tightened. He didn't just capture Prescott to get information. Captured Prescott to get me. To get us to move, to use the network, to put ourselves inside a structure he could see. And instead, you gave him this address. I gave him Bellacorte, which he already had. Dante leaned forward. Elena, does Harlan know all 7 safe points? Harlan went still across the room. Elena looked at Harlan, and the moment stretched 1 second too. And in that stretch, Dante watched something happen between Elena and her security man that he couldn't entirely read. Communication passing through a look. The way long-established trust sometimes communicated without language. And then Elena said, Harlan has operational knowledge of the network's infrastructure. Yes. Dante looked at Harlan. Harlan looked back at him with the particular steadiness of a man who understood what was being examined and had made peace with it. You've been with her since the beginning, Dante said. 22 months. How did she find you? She didn't, Harlan said. Found her. I was working private security for a firm that had a contract with an Adriano-adjacent financial entity. When that entity was restructured, I was left with a skill set and a choice about how to use it. I approached Elena through Prescott. Dante turned to Elena. Prescott vouched for Harlan, he said. She said nothing. Prescott vouched for Harlan, Dante said again, and Prescott has been Silas's asset, possibly for months, possibly longer. He kept his eyes on her. How much does Harlan know about the archive's structure? Dante Elena started. How much? She looked at Harlan, then back at Dante. Operationally, she said carefully. He knows the trigger conditions. He knows the check-in protocol. Does he know the physical location? No. Does he know enough about the trigger mechanism too? Stop. Elena's voice was sharp. Harlan has been with me for 22 months. He's pulled me out of 3 situations that would have ended this entire operation. He was in that car with us this morning. He was also in the car when we drove to a location that Silas is now looking for, Dante said. And he was on the phone in the next room for 6 minutes when we arrived here. Harlan said quietly, and without heat, I was coordinating the extraction of 2 of Elena's secondary contacts who were exposed when Bellacorte got burned. You can check the call log. I will, Dante said. You should. Elena looked between them. Her face was doing something complicated, the calculation of a person who had spent 3 years trusting carefully and precisely and was now sitting in a room where the ground under every trust was becoming questionable at the same time. Give me the phone, she said to Harlan. He handed it without hesitation. She went through the call log. She verified the contacts. She handed it back. It clears, she said to Dante. For now, he said. Dante, I'm not accusing him. I'm saying the situation has changed, and every assumption we came in with needs to be re-examined, including comfortable ones. He held her gaze. You told me that yourself. Second manipulator. Unknown agenda. You said you hadn't ruled it out. She was quiet. I hadn't, she said finally. So we rule nothing out. We verify everything. We operate from what we can directly confirm and nothing else. He sat back, starting with the archive. The dead man's switch. If Silas has Prescott and can suppress the mechanism, we lose our primary leverage. Is there a way to accelerate the release on your end? To trigger it before he can suppress it? Yes, she said. But triggering it early means the documentation goes to federal and journalistic recipients before we've had time to position. Before Silas is contained, he'd get wind within hours and disappear. How many hours? If the release triggers now, assuming he has people monitoring, for exactly that 3 to 5 hours before he's in the wind, maybe less. And if we wait, if Prescott breaks and Silas suppresses the mechanism, we lose the archive entirely. We lose our leverage. We lose the evidence, and Silas can move openly. Dante stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the city below, ordinary, indifferent, moving through its morning with no knowledge of any of this. Third option, he said. Elena waited. We don't trigger the archive, and we don't wait for Silas to suppress it. We go and get Prescott back. The silence was absolute. Then Harlan said very carefully, Prescott has been in Silas Creed's custody for approximately 12 hours. We don't know where he's being held. We don't know his condition. We don't know how many men Silas has with him. And Silas currently believes, or will shortly believe, that we're operating blind inside his network. Yes, Dante said. You want to walk directly into that. I want to find out where Silas is holding him. I want to use the 48 hours before Silas finishes whatever he's extracting from Prescott. And I want to use the one advantage we have that Silas has not accounted for. Which is, Elena said. Dante turned from the window. Me, he said. Silas still believes I'm operating from the same playbook I've always used. He's known my methods for 27 years. He knows how I respond to threats, how I move, who I call, what I prioritize. He paused. He built his entire operation around predicting me. And he was right about me, right about all of it, until about 6 hours ago. Elena looked at him. You're a different variable now, she said slowly. I'm a variable he hasn't modeled. Because the version of me he planned for doesn't work with you, doesn't trust you, doesn't know what you know. He held her gaze. Everything he's built assumes that Dante Morelli and Elena Vale are broken, that we're operating separately, that I'm angry and she's isolated and neither of us has the full picture. But we do. He moved back to the table. Which means the most dangerous thing we can do to Silas right now is not trigger the archive, not run, not fight him on ground of his choosing. The most dangerous thing we can do is let him keep thinking. He knows exactly what we're going to do next, while we do something completely different. Elena was quiet for a moment. You want to feed him a false position, she said. I want him to believe he's winning, Dante said. Right up until he isn't. She looked at him, this man she'd studied for 3 years from the inside, whose habits and fears and blind spots she knew with the intimacy of someone who'd shared a house with them, and she was recalibrating, could feel it running the new version of him against the model she'd built, looking for the discrepancies. There were more than she expected. All right, she said, and then, before she could say anything else, her phone, a secondary device, a number only 5 people alive, had buzzed once on the table. Picked it up. One message. Sender. Unknown. He already knows you're together. He knows the Carver Street address. You have 40 minutes. Elena looked up. Dante read her face. How, he said. She was already standing. That question gets answered later. Right now, we need. And then every light in the building went out, and from the street below came the sound of vehicles, multiple, coordinated, moving fast, and Dante Morelli stood in the sudden dark and understood that the 40 minutes had already been a lie, and that Silas Creed was not waiting anymore. Dante moved before the echo of the last vehicle's sound finished bouncing off the walls. Stairwell, he said, and his voice had dropped to the register he used when options were gone, and decisions were the only thing left. He grabbed Elena's arm, not rough, not gentle, simply decisive, and they were moving. Before Harlan had fully processed the situation, though Harlan was good and he caught up fast, falling in behind them with his flashlight low and his weapon already out. Stairwell door was at the north end of the floor. Dante hit it with his shoulder and held it for 2 seconds, listening. Below them, nothing yet. Above them, the roof, which was access but also exposure. He made the calculation in the space of one breath. Down. How many floors to the parking structure connection, Elena said. She was right behind him, her hand on his shoulder blade, using him as a reference point in the dark, the way people who'd been trained for this used physical contact. 3, he said. 2nd floor. There's a corridor that connects to the structure's 2nd level. They'll know about the structure. They'll cover the ground exits. The 2nd level connection puts us above street coverage. He was moving as he talked, one hand on the rail, counting the landings. Renzo. Already messaged him, Harlan said from behind. 30 seconds out, 2nd level ramp. Good. Renzo was a man who could read a situation from a text message the way other men read a paragraph. They made the 2nd floor landing. Dante eased the door open and looked through the gap, a corridor, emergency lighting only. The red glow making everything look like the inside of something that had already caught fire. Scanned left to right. Clear. They moved through the corridor fast. Not running. Running was noise and noise was position, and Dante kept his eyes on the far door, the one that opened onto the parking structure walkway, and he was calculating the entire time. Silas had the address. Silas had cut the power. Silas had vehicles on the street. That was a minimum four-man operation at street level, plus whoever killed the building's power, which required either building access or utility knowledge. Someone had given Silas very specific information about the Carver Street building, not general knowledge. Specific floor access, power infrastructure, the kind of detail you got from blueprints or from someone who'd been inside. Dante filed it and kept moving, the walkway door. He pushed through, and the cold air of the parking structure hit them concrete smell, oil, the particular dead echo of an enclosed space. Could see Renzo's car below, headlights off, idling at the second-level ramp in exactly the right position. Then from his left, at the far end of the structure's second level, a figure stepped out from between two parked cars. Dante stopped. Elena stopped behind him. The figure was backlit by a single functioning structure, light 40 feet back, and it took Dante 2 seconds to recognize the silhouette. Particular way, the man held his weight on his left side because of an old knee injury from a decade ago that he'd never fully recovered from. Luca Marin, one of Dante's crew leaders, a man who'd been with the organization for 9 years and who Dante had promoted twice and trusted with territory management on the east side. Luca had a gun at his side, not raised. That detail mattered, Boss Luca said. Dante stood very still. Luca, I need you to hear me out. You're standing in a parking structure that Silas Creed sent men to cover holding a weapon, and you want me to hear you out. I'm standing here because I got here first, Luca said. If I was with Silas's people, I'd have 3 men with me, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. He paused. I was the one on the roof at Bellacorte. Dante heard Elena's breath shift behind him. Just barely. You sent the warnings, Elena said. Luca looked past Dante at her. Every one of them. You're Prescott's contact, Elena said. You're the source. I'm the source, Luca confirmed. I'm not Prescott's contact. I've never met Prescott. Found my own route in. He kept his eyes moving, checking the structure's levels, the entry points, not looking at Dante straight on, which Dante noted because Luca was his man who generally held eye contact. He was ashamed of something. I've been inside Silas's secondary operation for 14 months. He recruited me 2 years ago. He told me it was a loyalty structure, a way of ensuring the organization's continuity if something happened to Dante. I believed him for about 4 months before I started to understand what continuity actually meant. And then you kept going, Dante said. The weight in those words was not small. Yes. Luca's jaw worked. I kept going because I thought I could gather enough to be useful. And because walking away from Silas isn't something you do by just deciding to. How many of my people has he recruited? 11. Not 8 like he glanced at Elena. Not 8. 11. He added 3 in the last 2 months. Moving faster because he's almost ready. Ready for what? He has a meeting set. 3 days from now. The under-network the men loyal to him, plus 2 external partners he's been courting for 18 months. The agenda is transition of control. He's going to present your operation as a going concern under new leadership, and he's going to offer your key external relationships. The same terms you provided, plus a 10% funded by reserves he's been building for years. Luca paused. After the meeting, you become a liability to be managed. Managed, Elena said flatly. That's the word he uses. Luca finally looked at Dante directly. I'm telling you this because the meeting is in 3 days, and Prescott gives him the archive suppression within the next 12 hours, probably less. And once that's done, there's no documentation and no leverage, and Silas moves the timeline up. He swallowed. I'm telling you, because there are men in your organization, Dante, who are loyal to you and don't know any of this is happening. And when Silas makes his move, they're going to be standing in the wrong place. Dante looked at him for a long moment. Where's Prescott? Luca hesitated. Luca. Silas has a facility, not one of the organization's standard holdings of private property, registered under a shell he built 14 years ago and never touched operationally until now. Waterfront. South Basin, near the old shipping terminal. He gave the address. I've been there twice. It's 4 rooms on the 2nd floor of a warehouse structure. Keeps 4 men on site minimum. Tonight, probably more. Is Prescott still functional? As of 8 hours ago. Silas is being careful. He needs Prescott cooperative, which means he's using pressure, not damage. Prescott's not built for this. He's a systems man. He'll break today, probably, Elena said. There's still time. There's a window, Luca said. Small one. Dante turned to Elena. If we get Prescott out before he breaks, the archive stays locked. Silas loses his suppression timeline. And we keep our leverage, she said. But we need to move in the next 6 hours, Luca said. Maybe less. From somewhere below in the structure, the sound of a door. All 4 of them went still. Then Renzo's voice, low and strained, came through Harlan's earpiece. Company coming up the west ramp. 2 vehicles. Harlan looked at Dante. Dante looked at Luca. Can you drive? Dante said. Yes. There's a car on this level, gray sedan, northeast corner. Keys are above the visor. He didn't explain how he knew. He just knew. Take it. South Basin Warehouse. I want eyes on that location before we move. Position and count. Text Harlan. Luca nodded. He moved, and he moved fast, the limp barely showing, and then he was gone into the structure's shadow. And Dante was turning back, and they were at Renzo's car in 15 seconds and inside in 20, and moving before the west ramp vehicles reached the second level. Renzo drove without being told where. He'd learned long ago that Dante gave directions when he had them and improvised the rest, and the correct response was to get distance first and ask questions after. He took them north, then east, then doubled back south, on a route that felt random and wasn't. Dante sat in the back with Elena beside him. Harlan was in the front. Nobody spoke for 3 minutes. Then Elena said, quietly, Luca's been carrying that for 14 months. Yes. Do you trust him? Dante looked out the window. Buildings moving past. I trust that he's been feeding you accurate intelligence for 4 months at personal risk. I trust that he got to Bellicorte ahead of Silas's men, which means he knew about the location through Silas and chose to warn you instead of report you. He paused. I trust his information. His motives I'll sort out when this is over. That's not the same as trust. No, it's not. He turned to look at her. I'm done operating on trust without verification. I thought that was a weakness. Turns out, it was the only thing that kept me running for 12 years while Sal built his operation inside mine. I just applied it to the wrong person. She looked at him. In the moving dark of the car's interior, with the city light coming through in fragments, she looked tired, not weak. Nothing like weak, but the specific fatigue of someone who had been running at full capacity for a very long time on insufficient resources, and who could see the end of something from where they were standing but couldn't yet tell if the end was a finish line or a cliff. The waterfront facility, she said. 4 rooms, 4 guards minimum, tonight more. Getting Prescott out of there is not a 2-person operation. No, Renzo and Harlan. And however many of my people I can verify in the next 2 hours as not belonging to Silas. He pulled out his phone, started a list. Of 40 men on his payroll, 11 confirmed Silas loyalists per Luca, 29 remaining. Of those 29, how many had been managed, briefed, or influenced by Silas in ways that stopped short of formal recruitment? Couldn't know. He could narrow it. He called 3 men in the next 20 minutes. Men he'd known before Silas men, whose entry into the organization predated his father's consigliere by years, whose loyalty was to the name Morelli in the old way, which was not always a morally clean thing, but was at this particular moment a structurally reliable one. He told each of them the minimum necessary. Waterfront location. Distraction. Tonight. Don't tell anyone. All 3 said yes without asking for explanation. That was something. It wasn't enough, but it was something. By the time Luca's text came through to Harlan, with the position and count 7 men on site, 2 vehicles at the waterfront entrance, 2 more on the structure's east side. Prescott confirmed on the 2nd floor based on light pattern in a specific window. They had a 6-person team and a 3-hour window. They staged at a salvage yard a half-mile from the waterfront. Renzo knew the owner, who was the kind of man who'd learned that knowing Dante Morelli socially was a useful thing and asked no questions about unusual requests. Elena pulled Dante aside while Harlan briefed the 3 additional men. I need to tell you something, she said, before we go in. Tell me. The dead man's switch, I said. Biometric confirmation fingerprint. She looked at him steadily. That's true, but it's not the complete structure. There are 2 confirmations required, mine and 1 other. Dante waited. Prescott's, she said. I built it that way, because a single-point biometric system has failure modes. If I'm incapacitated, if my confirmation is compromised, I needed a second factor. Someone who had as much to lose as I did from the archive falling into the wrong hands. She paused. That's why Silas took Prescott. He doesn't just need the suppression architecture. He needs Prescott's confirmation to dissolve the system entirely. Dante absorbed this. So if Silas gets both of you, the archive becomes his to control. Release it, suppress it, edit it, destroy it. She held his gaze. He doesn't need to kill me. He needs to control me. That's why the cars last night weren't a kill team. He needs me sitting somewhere quiet where he can use my confirmation when the time is right. He needs you alive and accessible. Which is, she said, the only reason we've had the time we've had. Dante stood with that for a moment. Then, after tonight, when Prescott is out and the archive's confirmation structure is intact, what's the plan for the meeting in 3 days? We use it, she said simply. We give Silas his meeting. We let him believe he has the momentum, the timeline, the men, and we let him walk into a room where everything he thinks he controls has already been handed to the people he never wanted to see it. Controlled burn. A controlled burn, she confirmed. To do that, I need tonight to work. I need Prescott functional and free and able to confirm his biometric within the next 6 hours so I can verify the system's integrity before Silas's timeline expires. Then let's go get him, Dante said. The waterfront approach took 40 minutes of careful staging. They split into 3 pairs, Dante and Harlan, at the main structure entrance. Renzo, with one of the additional men, covering the east side, and the remaining 2 circling to the north waterfront edge to cut off any waterside exit. Luca's surveillance had been clean. 7 men, positioned as described, and the light in the second-floor window was still on, which was the detail Dante held onto because it meant Prescott was still there and still conscious. They moved on Dante's signal. The next 4 minutes were the most compressed 4 minutes of Dante Morelli's adult life. Not the most dangerous he'd been in worse, but the most dense, every second, carrying a weight and consequence, that he felt with a physical specificity. His heartbeat was elevated but controlled. His hands were steady. His mind was doing the thing it did in high-pressure situations, narrowing, going quiet, operating on something older and faster than thought. 2 men on the east side went down first Renzo's pair, quiet and fast. The front entrance was harder. 3 of Silas's men inside the ground floor of the warehouse, positioned well, and for 90 seconds, it was the kind of controlled, close-quarters chaos that Dante's body knew how to navigate even when his brain was still catching up. Harlan took a hit left side, not critical, through and through on the lateral, but it knocked his movement, and he went to one knee, and Dante covered him and kept moving because stopping was death. Second-floor stairwell. 2 more men. Dante went through the first one at the landing, and Harlan, upright again and moving on sheer stubbornness, handled the second at the top, the door at the end of the corridor. Dante hit it. Prescott was inside, seated, wrists zip-tied to a chair. He was a medium-sized man, in his mid-50s, with an accountant's build and a face that had been doing hard things with stress for approximately 17 hours. He looked up when the door came open, and his expression moved through terror to recognition to something that was almost, not quite, relief. Elena, he said immediately. Is Elena safe? Dante said. He was already cutting the zip ties. We need to move right now. Prescott started. I know what Silas has. We're dealing with it. Can you walk? Prescott stood, unsteady but functional. I didn't tell him anything about the suppression mechanism. I'll know in 6 hours whether that's true, Dante said, and there was no harshness in it, just the clean practicality of a man who'd stopped operating on faith. Right now I need you vertical and moving. Prescott moved. They were back down the stairs and out the east side in 3 minutes. And Renzo had the vehicle repositioned, and they were loading in and moving in 4, and Harlan was bleeding steadily through a compression he'd made from his own jacket, but he was upright and his eyes were clear, and he said, I'm fine, in the tone of a man who was going to be fine through sheer refusal to be otherwise. In the vehicle, Prescott grabbed Dante's arm. There's something I have to tell you, he said. Something I didn't tell Silas about the archive. Dante looked at him. It's not just financial documentation, Prescott said. Elena's father, Marcus Vale, he wasn't only tracking Silas's operation. He was tracking his contacts, his external relationships, people Silas's fed intelligence to outside the organization. He swallowed. 3 of those contacts are sitting federal officials. One of them is senior enough that Silas has been using the relationship as a guarantee a dead man's protection for himself. If Silas goes down, he takes the federal contact with him, which means the federal contact has been making sure Silas never goes down. Dante was very still. A federal protection arrangement, he said. A mutual one. 14 years. Prescott's voice was shaking slightly, but the information was precise. It's all documented. Every contact, every exchange, every piece of intelligence, Silas passed. The most protected part of the archive. Elena knows it exists. I don't know if she's told you. Dante looked at Prescott for one more second. Then he turned and looked out the window. He thought about Elena in the safe house with the remaining team, waiting. He thought about everything she'd built and protected and carried alone. And he thought about the specific thing she had and hadn't told him. And he held the anger of it very still while he decided what to do with it. When we get back, he said, you're going to sit down with Elena and Harlan and me, and you're going to tell us everything. Not the summary. Everything. Prescott nodded. And then Dante said, we're going to make sure Silas Creed walks into that meeting in 3 days believing he's already won. Pulled out his phone and sent Elena a single text. Prescott is out. He's intact. We need to talk about the federal contact. 3 seconds later, her reply came back. I know. I was going to tell you tonight. I needed to know if you were the right kind of instrument first. Dante read the message. He almost laughed. It was the wrong moment for it. Harlan bleeding beside him. Prescott trembling in the back. The city moving past in the cold early hours. But the almost law was there, genuine and briefly, because the honesty of it was so entirely her that it cut through every complicated thing and left something simpler. He typed back, am I? The reply took longer this time. Long enough that he looked out the window and watched the waterfront disappear behind them and waited. Then, getting there, he put the phone away. The safe house was 40 minutes north. In those 40 minutes, Dante sat with everything he knew and built the next 72 hours in his mind. The way he built everything methodically, leaving room for what he couldn't predict, designing for the failure modes so that when something broke, it broke into the next piece of the plan rather than into chaos. Silas would know by morning that the waterfront facility had been hit. He'd know Prescott was gone. He'd know the timeline had changed. What he wouldn't know, couldn't know yet, because the information hadn't reached him, was that Dante had 11 confirmed names, and a federal contact on record, and a documentation structure that was still fully armed, and that the man he'd spent 27 years managing had finally, in the last 12 hours, become entirely unpredictable. Pulled up to the safe house. Elena came to the door before they were fully stopped. She saw Harlan's condition. First her eyes went to the compression, assessed, moved to his face, made the determination that he was functional. Then she looked at Prescott and something in her exhaled. Then she looked at Dante. He got out of the car and stood in front of her in the cold pre-dawn air. And for a moment neither of them said anything, because there was too much to say and not enough time to say it correctly. And they'd both pressure until the light changed, to spend enough time around people who talked when they should have been acting to know the difference. The meeting's in 3 days, he said. Yes. We need 48 hours to set the trap correctly. And the federal contact, I need everything. Name, documentation, the full record. She nodded. After we sleep, she said, 2 hours, both of us. Because what happens next requires us thinking clearly, and neither of us has slept. He looked at her. 2 hours, 2 hours. He followed her inside. And behind them, in a building across the city, Silas Creed stood at a window with his phone to his ear and listened to the report about the waterfront facility. And he said nothing for a very long time. And then he said, very quietly, accelerate the meeting. Tomorrow night. And find out who Luca Marin has been talking to, because I want to have that conversation myself. He hung up. He looked out at the city below his city. His operation, his 27 years of careful, patient construction, and he felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that he did not immediately recognize because it had been so long since it had visited him. He recognized it, finally. It was the feeling of a man who had built his entire life on knowing exactly what everyone around him would do next, standing in the moment. He understood that he no longer knew. He slept in shifts, 2 hours each, as agreed, though neither of them slept particularly well. Dante on a narrow couch in the safe house's back room, with one ear always half open, and Elena at the table, with her head on her folded arms for 90 minutes before she gave up and made coffee, and sat with a ledger and her own notes spread in front of her, while the pre-dawn dark outside thinned slowly toward gray. Prescott slept deeply and completely, the sleep of a man whose body had simply stopped negotiating. Harlan had his wound properly dressed, clean exit, no critical damage, the kind of injury that hurt consistently and significantly without being life-ending, and he sat with it, and said nothing about it, which was consistent with everything else Dante had observed about the man. At 5 a.m., they sat together, all four of them, around the table with coffee, and the full documentation spread between them, and Prescott told them everything. Federal contact was a man named Aldous Crane, Deputy Director, Organized Crime Division, 22 years in the position, the kind of institutional fixture that accumulated so much internal knowledge and so many interlocking favors that removing him had become structurally inconvenient for everyone around him. Silas had cultivated the relationship over 14 years, not through blackmail initially, but through the oldest mechanism available, mutual benefit. Crane got intelligence that made his division look effective. Silas got protection from the specific federal attention that would have made his parallel operation impossible to run in the end. Over time, the relationship calcified into something more binding than convenience. Silas had accumulated documentation on every exchange, and Crane understood that the documentation existed. And so the relationship continued, because the alternative for Crane was catastrophic. How senior, Dante said. Senior enough that a direct prosecution of Silas through standard channels would have reached Crane's desk, Prescott said, which is why it never happened. Every time Silas's operation came up on a federal radar, Crane redirected the attention, and Marcus Vail documented all of this. Everything. He understood what he had. It's why Silas had him killed, not primarily because of the Adriano network records, but because of the Crane documentation. That was the piece Silas couldn't afford to have surface. Elena was sitting with her hands around her coffee cup, looking at the table. She'd heard this before Dante could tell by the absence of surprise in her body, but hearing it stated plainly, out loud, in a room with other people, seemed to cost her something. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry. Your father understood that the Crane connection was the most dangerous piece, Dante said to her. Yes, she said. He built the archive around it. Everything else was context. Crane documentation was the core, and that's why you needed Silas contained before you triggered the release. Because if the Crane connection surfaced through standard channels, Crane would have buried it, redirected the investigation, made the documentation appear fabricated. She looked up. The only way to make the Crane documentation actionable was to deliver it in a context where Crane couldn't redirect. Somewhere the jurisdiction didn't run through his desk. How, Dante said. She met his eyes, simultaneous delivery, to 3 separate recipients who don't share an oversight structure. 2 federal different divisions, different chains, and 1 journalistic. If all 3 receive it at the same moment, Crane can't run interference fast enough on all 3 simultaneously. One of them gets through. That's the dead man switch structure. That was always the design, she said. Not a panic button. Precision instrument. She paused. The problem was timing. Triggering it before Silas was in custody meant he'd run. Triggering it after he was in custody, assuming a conventional arrest, meant it ran through channels where Crane could still reach it. Dante was quiet for a moment. So the arrest can't be conventional, he said. The arrest can't be conventional, she confirmed. Which is why you need the meeting, Dante said. Not to catch Silas with evidence. Create a situation where the people in the room become the evidence. Where Silas's own lieutenants, his own recruited network, see what he's built and understand what it means for them personally and make a decision about which side of this they want to be standing on when it collapses. Elena looked at him. When did you work that out, she said. About an hour ago while I wasn't sleeping, he said. Something moved across her face. Not a smile too tired for a smile, but something adjacent to it. Then you understand what I need from you tomorrow night. I understand what we both need to do. She held his gaze. And for the first time since this had started, since the 12 black cars and the window and everything that came after, Dante felt the conversation between them shift from two people managing a crisis in parallel to two people who were actually, genuinely working together, not strategically adjacent. Together, it was an unfamiliar feeling. He found, to his mild surprise, that he didn't dislike it. They spent the next 36 hours building what Elena called the geometry of the trap. Dante reached out to Silas through a channel Silas would expect his personal assistant, a routine communication, carefully worded to convey exactly what Silas needed to believe. That Dante was rattled, that the events of the previous night had shaken him, that he wanted a meeting with his senior people to stabilize the organization. And could Silas arrange it for the following evening at Cascante's, one of Dante's restaurants, familiar ground, a place where Silas would feel the balance of power running in his direction? Silas agreed within 20 minutes. That was the first confirmation that Silas was moving on an accelerated timeline and couldn't afford to decline. A cautious man would have suggested a different location or a delay. Silas said yes immediately, which meant he was already thinking about the meeting as an opportunity rather than a risk. That was his mistake. It would not be his last. Elena spent those 36 hours on communications that Dante was not entirely privy to. She was clear about what she needed from him and clear about what she was handling herself, and he found that he could sit with the not knowing in a way he hadn't been able to 2 days ago. She was building the recipient structure for the archive release. She was coordinating timing with 2 federal contacts who were not Crane's people. She spent years identifying the fracture lines in the federal organizational chart, the places where divisions operated independently enough that Crane's oversight didn't reach. She had names. She had relationships she'd cultivated through the Adriano Network's surviving infrastructure. She'd been building toward this for 7 years. Dante had been inside his own organization, running it, trusting Silas, and building the container she needed without knowing he was doing it. He sat with the specific humility of that and said nothing. Luca came in on the second day. Dante had sent for him a direct contact, no intermediary, and Luca arrived looking like a man who'd made peace with a reckoning and was simply waiting for it to arrive. He sat down across from Dante and didn't offer explanations or justifications for the 14 months. He just sat. "You know which of the 11 are in the room tomorrow night," Dante said. "All of them. Silas wants full attendance. He's presenting the transition as an organizational development. He's not revealing his hand until everyone's in the room, and he controls the exits." Does he control the exits? Luca looked at him steadily. "He thinks he does. Can you get a message to any of the 11 before tomorrow night? Someone who went in because of pressure rather than loyalty." Luca thought for a moment. 2 of them. Maybe 3. I don't need them to do anything. I need them to know that what happens in that room is being documented, that whoever is standing with Silas when the lights come on is going to be treated differently than whoever isn't. Dante paused. "I'm not offering amnesty. I'm offering the difference between being on the wrong side of something and being the person who helped correct it." Luca nodded. "I can deliver that." "One more thing," Dante said. "Silas is going to know you're the one who fed information to Elena. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but he'll trace it. He's thorough. I know. After tomorrow night, there won't be anything for him to do about it. But between now and then, I stay out of sight," Luca said. "I know." Dante looked at him. "You spent 14 months inside something you knew was wrong, and you spent 4 of them trying to pull it apart from the inside." He paused. "I'm not going to tell you what that was worth, but I'm noting it." Luca's jaw moved once. He didn't say anything. He stood, and Dante stood, and they didn't shake hands because neither of them was wired for that kind of moment. But something passed between them that was its own thing, and then Luca left. Cascante's, on a Thursday evening, ran the way it always ran: white tablecloths, low lighting, the kind of professionally warm atmosphere that made conversations feel private, even in a room full of people. Dante had reserved the private dining room at the back, which held 20 comfortably, and which had, over the years, hosted more consequential discussions than its tasteful decor suggested. He arrived first. That was deliberate. He sat at the head of the table and ordered a glass of water and waited. And while he waited, he looked at the room, the walls, the ceiling, the light fixtures, specific placement of every chair, and he thought about the 27 years, during which a man he trusted had been running a patient, meticulous betrayal inside everything Dante had built. And he filed the thought carefully and set it down. Somewhere, it wouldn't interfere with the next 2 hours. Silas arrived at 7:15. He came in ahead of the others, which was also deliberate, arriving before the group so he could read the room and read Dante before the dynamics of the full gathering complicated his assessment. He was wearing charcoal as always. His silver hair was immaculate. His face, when he saw Dante sitting alone at the table, moved through a calculation that was very fast and very practiced, and arrived at a landing of easy warmth. Dante. He took a seat not at the far end, but 2 chairs down from Dante's right, close enough to be collegial, far enough to give the appearance of deference. "You look tired. 2 rough nights," Dante said. "I heard about the waterfront situation." Silas shook his head. "I've been trying to track down who was responsible for—" "Let's wait for the others," Dante said. "I'd rather go through it once." Silas nodded agreeably. Over the next 20 minutes, the room filled. Senior crew members, logistics leads, the structure of Dante's organizations assembling itself around the table the way it had assembled itself in rooms like this for years. Dante watched them come in. He watched who sat where. He watched who glanced at Silas before choosing their seat, and who sat without looking at him at all. And he cataloged it, the way he cataloged everything now carefully, without visible reaction. By his count, 9 of Silas's 11 were in the room. 2 absences, likely Luca's work, the message delivered, a calculation made. When the room was settled, Silas looked at Dante with the politely expectant expression of a man who was playing the second-in-command role so fluently that he'd been playing it for 2 decades without anyone noticing it was a role. "You asked for this meeting," Silas said. "The floor is yours." "Yes," Dante said. He reached beneath the table and placed the black ledger on the white tablecloth. The room's temperature changed. Not literally the climate control held, but something shifted in the air, the specific atmospheric change that happened in a room full of experienced people, when an object appeared that they hadn't expected and couldn't immediately categorize. Silas looked at the ledger. His face did nothing. That was, Dante thought, the most revealing thing he'd ever seen the man do. "This is Marcus Vale's documentation of your parallel operation," Dante said. He wasn't talking to the room. He was talking to Silas. 14 years of financial routing, communications, recruitment, including the names of 11 people in this organization who you brought into your network without my knowledge, 8 of whom are sitting at this table right now. The room erupted, not loudly, not chaotically. It was the eruptive sound of 9 separate conversations, starting at once and dying immediately, as each person realized that speaking was dangerous. Silas was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Dante, I think you've been through a difficult few days, and someone has given you material that was designed to—" "Aldous Crane," Dante said. Silas stopped. The name fell into the room's silence like a stone into still water. "Deputy Director, Organized Crime Division," Dante continued. 14-year mutual protection arrangement. Every exchange documented. 17 points of contact. He paused. "Including the 3 conversations that redirected federal attention away from your operation specifically." Silas looked at Dante, and for the first time in 27 years, the first time in any interaction, Dante could recall the man across from him was not managing the situation. He was inside it. "The ledger is a copy," Dante said. "The original archive has been in simultaneous delivery to 3 separate recipients for the last 45 minutes. 2 federal, 1 journalistic. None of them run through Crane's oversight structure." He let that settle. "Crane is currently being contacted by an agent from a division he has no administrative relationship with. His ability to redirect this particular situation expired approximately 40 minutes ago." Silas said nothing. Dante looked at the 8 men in the room who'd been Silas's. Some of them were looking at the table. 1 was looking at his phone. 2 were looking at Silas with expressions that had moved through several phases and arrived at something that was not loyalty. "What happens in the next few minutes is going to determine a great deal," Dante said to the room. "I'm not going to pretend the people in this room all made the same choices for the same reasons. Some of you were recruited. Some of you were pressured. Some of you made decisions I don't fully understand tonight. He paused. What I understand is that this organization runs on the ability to trust the person sitting next to you. And Silas Creed has been destroying that trust for 14 years while wearing the face of someone who protected it. One of the men at the table, a logistics lead named Pharaoh, who'd been with the organization for 7 years and who Dante had genuinely liked, stood up slowly. He set his phone on the table, face up, and slid it toward the center where everyone could see the screen. It showed an encrypted message. Luca's work, the message that had been delivered to the ones who might still choose. Pharaoh said, "I'm done," and walked to the far side of the room, away from Silas's end of the table, and stood there with his arms at his sides. 2 seconds later, a second man stood and did the same thing. Then a third. Silas watched it happen. His face had gone very still, not the practiced stillness of a man controlling his expression, but the involuntary stillness of a man watching a structure he spent 20 years building come apart in 3 minutes. He had his hands on the table. He was breathing. Beyond those 2 observable facts, he appeared to have receded somewhere interior. Then his hand moved toward his jacket. "Don't," Dante said. Quietly, not a shout. The word carried the absolute certainty of a man who had already accounted for this moment. From the room's 2 entry points, men appeared, not Dante's regular crew. Harlan's people, Elena's network, the surviving operational arm of the Adriano infrastructure, the ones who'd been quietly positioned in the restaurant's staff and kitchen and outside its exits for the last 4 hours. Silas looked at them. He looked at Dante. 27 years, he said. "Yes," Dante said, "you trusted me." "I did." And she stopped. He didn't say Elena's name. He seemed to understand that saying it would reveal something about where his calculation had gone wrong. And even now, even at the absolute end of everything he'd built, the reflex was to conceal. "She was never the problem you thought she was," Dante said. "She was the solution to one you didn't know you'd already created." Silas looked at him for a long moment. And then, with a specificity that Dante would carry for years, the man's face changed not into emotion exactly, but into something rawer than the performance that had occupied it for 27 years. It was the face of a man who was very tired and had been very tired for a very long time and had mistaken the machinery of control for the thing that made life worth the effort. He looked old. "Who was on the roof?" he said. "At Bellacourt, Luca Marin." Silas absorbed that. He nodded once slowly, as if confirming a calculation that had already run. "He was always too loyal to you," Silas said. "I should have recruited him differently." "You should have been worth recruiting for," Dante said. Harlan's people moved in. Silas did not resist. He stood when he was asked to stand, and he walked when he was asked to walk, and he did not look back at Dante or at the room or at the ledger Young sits in the white tablecloth. He simply went, the bearing of a man who had made his choices over 14 years and was now arriving at their destination. Federal agents from the division that had no relationship with Aldous Crane were waiting outside. The Crane situation took 11 days to resolve, which in federal terms was extraordinarily fast, and the speed was entirely a function of the simultaneous delivery structure Elena had built. The journalistic recipient published first, 40 hours after the archive arrived, and the publication created the specific kind of public record that made institutional misdirection impossible. Federal recipients were already moving before the publication hit, and the crossfire of jurisdictions meant that Crane's customary ability to redirect attention had nowhere to redirect to. He resigned on day 4. He was indicted on day 9. On day 11, a federal prosecutor contacted Dante through his attorney with a conversation request. Dante met with him for 3 hours and said what he could say, without compromising the portions of his own operation that sat in different legal territory, and the prosecutor, who was a practical man with a viable target in front of him, accepted the boundaries with the pragmatism of someone who understood which battle he was actually fighting. Silas Creed was the target. Silas Creed would be the case. Luca testified. The testimony was specific and well documented and corroborated by the archive at every material point. 2 of the 8 men who'd stood up in the Cascanti's room also cooperated, which added texture and detail to a case that was already structurally sound. Trial was 14 months away. The outcome, as Dante's attorney explained to him in the careful language of legal probability, was not significantly uncertain. In the months that followed, Dante did the thing he'd said he would do, and found it harder than he'd expected. He dismantled. Not everything. He was not naive enough to believe that total dismantlement was either possible or honest, given the nature of what he'd built and the nature of who he was. But the parts that ran on fear, on the kind of leverage that turned people into instruments, those he took apart methodically. The way you deconstructed something structural, carefully, making sure the walls didn't come down on the people standing inside them. The 3 restaurants, the construction company, the financial advisory firm, those he restructured under cleaner management with legitimate oversight and people who'd been with the organization long enough to know how to run things and who chose, when given the choice, to run them straight. Some men left. He didn't stop them. Some stayed and surprised him. Renzo, who had driven him through the worst 2 days of his professional life, without asking a single unnecessary question, turned out to have a specific talent for operational logistics that had been entirely wasted on driving, and Dante promoted him to a position that used it. Luca came back after the testimony, which Dante had not expected, and had told Luca directly he had not expected. "I know," Luca said, "but you're the only operation I know how to work inside. And it's a different operation now." Dante looked at him. "Is it?" he said. "From what I can see," Luca said. "Yeah." Dante put him on East Side territory management, which was what he'd always been suited for, and they did not discuss Bellacorte again. Elena did what she'd said she would do. She left. Not dramatically. There was no moment of declared departure, no scene with finality written into it. She simply completed the operational elements that required her presence, transferred the archive's documentation to the appropriate federal custodians under terms she'd negotiated herself with an attorney who charged an extraordinary hourly rate and was worth it, and then she was no longer in the immediate landscape of Dante's days. Found out through Harlan, who reached out once to confirm Prescott was safe and relocated, and that the Adriano network's surviving infrastructure was being formally dissolved. And then through his own observation of the empty space, where her presence had briefly and entirely reorganized his understanding of his own life. He did not call her. He told himself this was respect. On the days when he was being honest with himself, which were more frequent than they'd been a year ago, he acknowledged that it was also fear, a different kind than he'd ever allowed before. Specific fear of a man understood for the first time that something mattered enough to be lost properly. She had told him she refused to become another possession in his empire. He had understood it at the time with his intellect. In the months that followed, he understood it with the rest of him. So he did not call. He worked. He dismantled and rebuilt. He learned slowly and imperfectly, and with significant resistance from his own instincts, how to ask questions before he acted, and how to sit with uncertainty without immediately converting it into control. It was by any measure the hardest thing he'd ever done. 8 months after the Cascantes meeting, on an evening in October that had the particular quality of the year beginning to close, Dante came home to the estate and found Elena standing in the driveway. Not at the window, not watching from a distance. Standing in the driveway in a dark coat with a bag over one shoulder, the same bag he noticed, or one exactly like it, and looking at him with the same steadiness that had characterized every version of her he'd encountered in the year that had upended everything. He stopped the car, got out. They stood 10 feet apart. "You should have called," he said. "You should have called," she said. Pause. "I was respecting your decision," he said. "You were afraid of getting it wrong," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." She looked back at him. Something in her face was different from every version of it he'd catalogued: the controlled surface from their marriage, the compressed focus from the crisis, even the brief, exhausted honesty of the safe house. This was simpler, less defended. "I've been building something," she said. "Foundation, private security services for families that are being threatened by organized crime. People who don't have the access or resources to protect themselves through normal channels." She paused. "It turns out the skills I spent 3 years developing inside your household have legitimate applications." "I heard," he said. "I've been following it." She looked slightly startled. Just slightly. "I've been following what you've been doing too," she said. "The restructuring, the legitimate oversight structure." A pause. You fired 4 people who'd been with the organization for over a decade because they couldn't operate within the new boundaries. They couldn't adapt, he said, or you couldn't overlook what you'd have overlooked before. Same outcome, he said. She almost smiled. That same almost smile from the car 8 months ago. The one that had landed somewhere, unexpected in his chest and apparently hadn't moved. Why did you come, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The October evening moved around them, leaves. Low light, the specific quality of stillness that came right before dark in that part of the year. Because I finished something today, she said. The Foundation's first case. A family we were able to get out of a situation that would have ended badly. And I was sitting in my office afterward, and She stopped. She looked at the house and then back at him. I wanted to tell someone who would understand what it meant to finish something that started as a wound. Dante stood with that. And I'm the person you thought of, he said. You're the person I keep thinking of, she said. And the matter-of-fact honesty of it, no softening, no performance. Just the plain statement was so entirely consistent with everything that it knocked something loose in him. He hadn't known, was still braced. He walked toward her, not quickly, not with the urgency of someone reclaiming something, just steadily, the way a person moved when they were done, pretending the distance was correct. Stopped in front of her. Close. The archive, he said. The documentation. You spent 7 years building it, and now it's in federal custody. And the cases are moving. What comes next for you? The Foundation, she said. Real work, it matters. She paused. There's a lot of it. More than one person can do. Considerably more. He looked at her. I know some people who are good at operational security and logistics who are currently between engagements. She looked at him. Are you offering to help, or are you telling me you want to be involved in my work? Both, he said. Separately. If that's something you'd consider. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the same assessing precision she'd always had, seeing him, actually seeing him the way she always had, and he was only recently able to see her doing. You've changed, she said. I've started, he said. There's a difference. She nodded. Yes, there is. Elena. Yes. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it the way you answer everything. Without softening it, she waited. Did you ever actually? He stopped. Started again. Was there a version of the 3 years inside our marriage where it was something other than intelligence work for you? Some part of it. The question sat between them in the October air. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at him for a long time, and he let her look, because he understood now that the looking was not evasion, it was her being exact, giving him the precision he'd asked for. There were moments, she said finally, small ones. Dinner conversations where I forgot what I was listening for and just listened. Days when the house felt like somewhere I was living rather than somewhere I was working. She paused. I never let those moments influence the work. But yes, they existed. He held her gaze. That's enough, he said. It's a small amount, she said. I'm working with whatever I have, he said. That's also something I've recently learned to do. The almost smile came back, and this time it went a little further, not quite all the way, but further than before. And he thought it might be the most honest thing he'd ever seen a person's face do. I'm not moving back into the house, she said. I know. And I know, he said again. I'm not asking for what we had. I'm asking for the chance to build something that wasn't built on what either of us needed from the other. Something we'd actually choose. She looked at him. That's a different question than I expected, she said. I've had 8 months to think about what question to ask, he said. She was quiet for one more moment. Then she set her bag down on the gravel between them, not dramatically. Just setting it down, freeing her hands, and she looked at the house, and then at the sky, and then back at him. There's a lot of work ahead, she said. Yes, he said. For both of us. Yes. I'm not promising anything easy, she said. Neither am I, he said. I don't think I'm built for easy anymore. I'm not sure I ever was. She looked at him for a long moment, and he stood there and let himself be looked at completely, without managing the impression, without controlling what she was seeing, which was something he'd never done for another person in his life. And it was uncomfortable in a way that felt completely necessary. All right, she said. One word. The same word she'd used the morning he told her. He wanted a divorce calm, complete, decided, but carrying an entirely different weight now. Then it had been an ending that wore the faces of acceptance. Now it was something that had the shape of a beginning, though neither of them would have used that word, because they were both people who'd learned not to name things they weren't yet certain they could hold. Picked up her bag. She looked at the gesture. Dinner, he said. That's all. One thing at a time. She considered it. Brinavio's, she said. Not here, agreed, he said. They walked to the car. Not side by side, quite yet close, but with the specific space of two people who understood that the distance between them was something that had to be covered honestly, not collapsed. He opened the passenger door. She got in. He walked around to the driver's side and sat down and started the engine. And the gates opened ahead of them. And the October evening had gone to full dark now, with a sky that was clear and cold and full of the indifferent detail of a world that didn't arrange itself around anyone's story. He drove. She looked out the window. After a while she said, without turning toward him, "You asked if I ever forgot what I was listening for."
Yes.
There were more moments than I said, she said. I was being exact before. Now I'm being honest. Dante kept his eyes on the road. He didn't say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. He drove, and the city moved around them, ordinary, ongoing, indifferent to the specific gravity of two people, arriving at the same place from entirely opposite directions. And whatever came next would come the way most true things came, slowly, imperfectly, with no guarantee except the decision to keep showing up and asking the right questions. That, Dante Morelli had finally learned, was the only guarantee worth making.